Hello, and welcome to another episode of Virtual Coffee with Ashish. Today, we are talking about identity and access management in Azure, privileged identity access management in Azure. And I have one of our local favorites, MVP of Azure, David O'Brien here. And I'm going to bring him in. By the way, before we go into that, if you're watching this on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, say hi in the chat window. It's a live stream, so feel free to say hi. If you're watching this on Twitch, do that as well. If you're watching it on LinkedIn, connect as well. But every week, we produce videos on cloud security, different topics on cloud security. So enough about the show. Let's get the guest online. Hey, David, how are you?
Morning, Ashish. How are you?
Good, good. Thanks for coming in, man.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
No problem. I know it's a tradition, right? Cheers.
Cheers.
For people who don't know, David is a return guest for us, and so I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. I don't think I'm going to go to too much of the introduction, but for people who don't know you, who is David O'Brien?
David O'Brien is an Azure MVP for 7 years now, I think. I'm the owner and founder of Xyrus, an Australian cloud consulting company, and the founder of Argos, a new startup in the cloud security space.
Ooh, we should definitely get some of those interesting conversations going about the products that you're building as well. And just taking a pause there for a second, because clearly Azure, you've mentioned a couple of times. What is Azure cloud security for you?
A very, very big topic.
Like, what's your definition of it? When people say cloud security in Azure, what do you think of it?
I think of a lot of conversations with people, and because one of the reasons probably why you asked this question is because everybody understands something else when you say security, and it starts with the people, and that's when we usually also start talking about identity management. And at some point, we then get into actually the applications and the network security and app security. But especially around cloud, it usually starts around IAM.
Oh, okay. So from that perspective, I think it's a good topic because you mentioned you yourself are into IAM. By the way, hi Paul. That's all right. You're not late enough, man. You just came at the right time. I just wanted to call out that if you guys have any questions, just keep posting them on the comment section. Say hello to David as well. We're nice people. Even though he may be drinking tea right now, him and I are still friends with tea and coffee. We're nice people in general. So feel free to drop in your question. Oh, he doesn't even like coffee. Well, for anyone else, we're twinning with our beards. That's pretty much what it is. He just happens to have a shorter beard for the moment. Thanks for coming in again, Paul, and anyone else who wants to drop in and chime in. Feel free to leave your comments in the section as well in the chat window on the side. And identity and access management. What is identity and access management? And I know you can go in, like, it's like a very broad topic, but to simplify it for people who are coming in, let's talk about it from a perspective of the whole hybrid and Azure kind of perspective as well, please.
Yeah, so on Azure IAM, it's always around Azure Active Directory. So you always talk, when somebody says IAM, there's always Azure Active Directory, because that's your domain, that's your tenant. And that's sometimes also some terminology that people confuse. It's the tenant, that's where your identity lives. That's your Azure Active Directory. And if you're coming from a more Microsoft background, then the on-premises Active Directory is similar to it, even though underlying technology is very different. But the principles are very similar. Your identity lives in that Azure Active Directory store, and that's where you control your access to your Azure subscription. Another thing that people sometimes, and the Azure portal, when you sign up to it, confuses people a bit, I think, because you sign up to an Azure subscription, but really what you sign up to is a tenant, and underneath that you get your subscription. But the tenant creation is a bit abstracted away for you.
Oh, interesting. And I think for people who probably don't know the tenant definition, what tenants are, we did an episode on this. I think I'll probably leave the link for it somewhere here, which was Azure 101. Because it's Azure 201, we're going one level up. And from that perspective, does it change? How about identity management from a perspective of, if to your point, AAD is different to the on-prem Active Directory. In AAD world, is the identity management still say a localized user, or is it like, what do you gonna say? Like, what are the different kinds of it?
Yeah, so AAD has multiple types of users. So you can you create your local user, your local AAD user. That would be your cloud-only user, and these identities usually have the let's say David O'Brien at domain name .onmicrosoft.com. So these are the cloud local users. And as an alternative to that, pretty much every enterprise on this planet is most likely going to go and federate their local domains or their own domains onto Azure Active Directory, so that you can achieve single sign-on with your on-premises David, the domain name, the UPN, the user principal name into Azure Active Directory. That's how you also get your Office 365 email mailboxes. This Azure Active Directory identity spans a lot of applications in the Microsoft space. But yeah, you have your local cloud users and your federated users.
Oh, right. Okay. So, and federated users, you mean single sign-on?
Yeah.
I guess you can have your domain. Okay, fair enough.
Correct.
And
Yeah.
is that? And I do want to dive deep into this a bit, but I think before we dive deep, it's probably worthwhile calling out that out of these recommendations that are there for, or you can go federated, or you can have other kinds of users, is there a recommendation or a best practice for setting up identity in an Azure land, considering it's different from your on-prem Active Directory, and someone who's listening in who's probably like an on-prem version of this? How would they deal with? I guess how should they go forward with it?
Yeah, look, there's some big differences, even though it looks similar, and the name is also very similar with Active Directory. Underneath, the authentication is not Kerberos, and it's not LDAP, which you get on-prem. On Azure Active Directory, it's all modern authentication. So SAML, REST calls. It's very, very different from an underlying tag. You can achieve Kerberos authentication and LDAP by deploying another service which kind of hooks into AAD, but that could be a whole episode on its own.
Yeah.
The identity best practices really come down to the company that we're talking about. So not every company needs to go and federate. If you're a Gmail user, Gmail or G Suite company, G Suite customer, then you might not have Office 365 and Exchange Online. So there might not be a need for you to federate your local identities into Azure. So local cloud users might be fine. But from an identity point of view, there's then the whole, how do I secure my identities? How do I use actual human users versus robot users versus guest users? Because that's another type of identity. You can I could invite your identity, your external identity, into my tenant as a guest user, and then give you access to certain resources in my tenant, for example.
Wow. And maybe that's why explains this topic getting the most vote on the poll that I ran. It's just like, so there's so many layers to it, right? We haven't even gone into the Azure land. We're still like scratching the surface of identity access management. And just within that point, we have kind of spoken about people who can be invited into my Azure tenant. And then there are people who are just part of the tenant. But then there are, even within that, there's almost like separate pockets of the different kinds of people you can have.
I think you mentioned one very important thing. We're not at this point talking about Azure.
Yeah, that's right. We haven't even gone into it yet.
So it's called Azure Active Directory, but you need to think of it as a separate thing. The Azure Active Directory tenant really sits above all these Microsoft applications, of which Azure is one application that you can get access to from your tenant.
Yeah. And I think you kind of said it the right way, because people may make the mistake of comparing this to IAM, which is not exactly the same. Kind of the same, but not the same. Isn't that right?
Yeah. So you're talking about AWS IAM.
Sorry, yes. If you're talking about AWS IAM, yes.
Yeah. AWS IAM lives inside of the AWS account that you own. And Azure doesn't necessarily have identities that live in a subscription. You do RBAC, so robust access control. You do that inside of your Azure subscription as well. But the identity in almost all cases is external to the Azure subscription.
Interesting. And so the easiest way for anyone who's probably listening when this goes in the podcast version, it's a layer right on the top. It basically across all subscription. Now, subscription is an equivalent of a Google project or an AWS account coming in. But this is, so tenant is that layer right on the top. That's where the identity is. But in an AWS context, it's your individual account which has each of the identities in there. And then you kind of do whatever you are back on that, right?
Yeah, so an AWS equivalent could be, you've got your AWS organization and you federate external identities and then jump into each of these AWS account with that same identity.
Yeah, perfect. And just to take that a bit further, and the way I kind of describe this to other people so that every normal day people can understand this as well, it doesn't get too complicated. I describe this into choose two kind of set of boxes. One, there are human users, and then there is the robot users. So I think we've been scratching the surface on the human users so far. But in terms of covering up the human user component, we kind of have to, if I'm just saying this correctly, you have a user defined in the tenant who may be a guest or an existing user. Was there any other user in that space that you want to call out as a human user?
No, not really. No, you cannot be federated, but they're local still. And then
it's just a type of authentication at that point, but it's not like a different kind of user. Perfect. No. And what about robot users then? That's the other camp which people don't talk about.
Correct. If you come from an on-premises Active Directory world, then there's this concept of a service account.
Yeah.
And which would be a robot user. The thing is that service accounts never really were any different to the David O'Brien account, technically. People just went and called a service account SVC underscore something, and then that was your service account. Technically, it was just an Active Directory user. Microsoft did at some point release a managed service account. However, that had very limited support for applications. So what people then go and do is they go to Azure Active Directory, and they sometimes also just create for robot scenarios, basically for application scenarios. They sometimes go and apply that same mentality to Azure Active Directory and just create another Azure Active Directory user which then needs to authenticate against something. Problem with that is that, as a very, 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 very lots of emphasis on that, good practice, is that every Azure Active Directory user should have MFA enforced on them, right? It's free,
Mm.
it's out of the box. It's literally one tick box that you tick and your user has MFA enforced.
Yeah.
Obviously, an application cannot respond, or most applications probably don't respond to MFA claims out of the box, right? An application doesn't own a phone, or can respond to any prompts.
Yep.
So what people then unfortunately do is they just don't enforce MFA on these, on that user. Microsoft, however, went, and very early on in the AAD life, basically, they created something called an application registration. And if you go on Google or Bing or DuckDuckGo for it or whatever you want, you probably search for the SPN, Service Principal Name, TAM, or just app registration. And these are actual application identities that you can create. You get your application ID, you create a secret, and then the application can authenticate against any APIs that Azure and Azure AD and Office 365 expose with that application ID and application secret, like a proper application.
Perfect. And I think that reminds me, there's actually a third camp to this whole thing, which is a third party, which that has an identity into your Azure or AWS. And obviously, a lot of cloud providers have their own recommendation for, oh, great, this is how you deal with human users, this is how you deal with robot users. But how do you deal with third-party users? What does that look like?
Yeah, good question. Third-party applications, without bad mouthing other companies, there's different levels of maturity. Just like on AWS, they might ask for sometimes for an IAM user, which isn't necessarily the best. Sometimes they say, hey, deploy this CloudFormation template and you get an IAM role. Sometimes they say, hey, we can assume a role from our EC2 or whatever we have. Same on Azure. Sometimes they go and say, please create an AAD user for us and give us the username and password. Not necessarily great. The other thing is the application registration that I just mentioned. Yeah, they might say, can you please create an app registration, give us the application ID and the application secret.
Yeah.
If they expose themselves already as a web application, then they might go and publish themselves into the enterprise application gallery, which is another concept of applications where, for example, let's just take Facebook. If you wanted to allow people to log into Facebook from AAD with your own identity, because you might be a workplace user, workplace customer, and you want your employees to be able to log into Facebook Workplace with their work identities, you can install this enterprise application out of the gallery for Facebook, and that would then SAML authenticate into Facebook.
Oh, right. Okay. And so I guess, summarizing that again. So we have human users where the RBAC is. We have robot users where assuming there's RBAC as well.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, perfect. And then there's app registration. There's another app RBAC.
Yes.
Interesting. And where does the whole concept of is it RBAC more in terms of, say, you're defining a policy or a group policy in Active Directory, or AAD in this context, I guess, or is it more individual, like their objects called roles, or what's that thing called? How do I say RBAC?
Yeah, so we completely forget about group policy at this point,
Okay.
because group policy doesn't exist in AAD.
Uh-huh.
So we have built-in roles, and I think the important thing is we're still not even talking about Azure at this point. um,
Yes. We
yeah,
haven't even
we're
gone to
still
Azure yet. Yeah, yet here we are. Yes, go on.
yeah we're still talking about AAD objects and resources, and in AAD you can do RBAC, giving people access or people and applications access to groups.
Mm-hmm.
And these would be your AAD groups, where you just go and group identities together, and then you can add a group to a role, to an Azure Active Directory role, which would then give people specific permissions to AAD. So in
Interesting.
AAD, you can be a password administrator, you can be a security administrator. There's dozens of built-in roles. Now, if we want to
Oh,
go and talk about applying your identity and permissions to Azure, going down into the
yeah. I was
application
gonna
called,
say maybe we should probably get to the crux of
yeah,
it. Like,
um, we just and it's helpful to think of Azure as an application underneath the AAD tenant. So you can give somebody access to AAD.
yep,
Yeah. So your identity in AAD, you can give it access to AAD to do things in there. Yeah. Create a user, delete a user, change the user's password.
yep.
None of that gives a user access to Azure. Now, the next step would be if you needed access to
Feel so
Azure.
disappointed. We spoke about identity for half an hour and we haven't even reached Azure yet.
Um, and I think that's really the point that
That's
I'm
right.
also trying to make, right? You have your tenant layer on top of everything,
Yep.
but then you can give somebody access to Office 365 or Microsoft 365. You can give somebody access to Azure and other applications from that AAD tenant, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and once you've given somebody access to Azure, then we again talk about other RBAC aspects like access to an Azure role, access to Azure permissions. So there's a
Mm.
similar but separate RBAC model, not an
Yep.
identity model, but RBAC model inside
Yep.
of the application called Azure.
And I think it's worthwhile calling out as well to the fact that anyone who may be coming from another cloud provider, say Google Cloud or AWS, they might find this concept quite weird. But I think coming from a Windows world, I think the concept totally makes sense because we've always had applications, and you have their almost like your one Active Directory which rules them all. Then you have a domain, which kind of, for lack of a better word, I'm going to compare it to tenant in this context, which is your
Hmm.
domain, and that
Yeah,
allows you to kind of have access to different subscriptions, applications, and kind of so on.
correct.
And having coming from an identity management background myself, we kind of have to talk about another concept which a lot of people, and because we're touching RBAC as well, which is normal user versus privileged user.
Yeah,
Is our privileged user, now the whole concept is dealt in a very different way in AWS, in Google Cloud. Like there's the whole concept of you jump in read only and then you write by elevating your privileges.
yeah.
What does that look like in Azure land?
It by default. Um, so we're talking best practices here, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
best practice would
Ideal
be,
world. Let's go with ideal world first.
yeah. Um, best practice would be you log into Azure with David O'Brien user account, and all I have is either no permissions at all,
Okay.
or and I can't see anything, or all I get is read only. Yeah, because
Okay.
that's my base permissions, and then there's a feature, a service that's part of Azure Active Directory, which is called Privileged Identity Management. Unfortunately, I want to say it does cost a bit of money, not much. I think it's $5 per user per month.
$5 per user. Oh my God, so expensive.
And it's part of a license that almost every company has, anyways.
You mean enterprise company would have, or?
So pretty much every enterprise company
okay.
will have it, yeah. And if you're an Office 365 customer, for example, you will also already, in most cases, have that.
Okay.
So for most companies, it shouldn't be an extra expenditure.
Yeah.
But it could be. So I'm just calling out, it's part of not the basic
enough.
AAD license.
Yep.
So privileged identity management, or PIM, that would be where you go and then say, hey, I want to request access to a different role, to a higher privileged role. And the nice thing about this is you can actually configure a bit of a workflow around that, depending on the role. If I, for example, said, I want access to the global administrator role. Yeah, the global administrator role is essentially like your root account for actual human users.
Right.
And I could go and, as a global administrator, I can delete whole Azure subscriptions. Yeah, that's a very high privileged role. So if I want to access that, I can request the access, and then people have to approve that access. So there's an actual approval workflow that can be put behind PIM. Plus, the access you get is time boxed. So that's also configurable with a maximum time of 8 hours. So you don't have standing permissions forever. That would be the ideal way to do privileged identity management on Azure. Sometimes people go and do it a bit different. They kind of apply the principles from on-prem Active Directory, where you have your regular user, your non-admin user, that you use to log into your laptop, for example, and that has your mailbox and all of that configured. And if you need to do admin work, you then have your, _admin user. And on AAD, people do that sometimes as well. They have a normal user that they log in with. And if they need to do higher privileged role or actions, they log out again and log in to AAD with the admin account, which might have higher controls on it, shorter session tokens, MFA from everywhere, and things like that.
Okay, and to your point, well, and because we're not Microsoft at the moment, you can probably talk about this. How many people are actually following this?
Enterprise is quite a bit, I see. The smaller the company gets, and I think that's just at some point also a startup thing where companies sometimes just need to ship something, right? Security then comes second. It does depend. The privileged identity management is a more advanced concept when it comes to Azure. And as I said, there are ways to get around that, paying that extra license by just having a second user, for example, which you have to go and log in with. But then that user always has these permissions. There's no audit trace, right? And if people have that user and have access to that user, people at some point, because we are all lazy, instead of logging in with one user and then realizing, oh, actually, I need to do this other thing, at some point, we will always go and just log in with the admin user. always.
That is so. Wait, what do you? I don't log in with my admin user. I have MFA. uh,
Exactly.
yeah, I was gonna ask. We kind of covered a few things, and I just was going through my notes. We didn't cover managed identity as a
Yeah,
concept. What is that?
yeah. That's managed identities, and then the identities that you can give to an Azure resource. So on or the equivalent on AWS could be the AWS EC2 instance role, for example. So that an EC2 instance assumes. So let's say we're running an application. Let's just take our Argos application. So our application runs on Azure Functions, and so all serverless, and our application, a .NET Core application, needs to do something on Azure Cosmos DB. Our backend is Azure Cosmos DB, NoSQL offering by Microsoft, and the application needs to authenticate against this other Azure service. We could obviously go and just hard code the access key or the connection string into our application, right? We could do that, and then David, the security auditor, comes along and looks at the code and says, "Oh, that
Yeah.
don't do that." Um,
As you were saying that, I was just keeping my ears like la 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 la.
um, so we're obviously not doing that
Yep.
because that's a terrible practice.
Do
Instead,
not kids do not follow this at home.
yeah. Instead, what you can do is you can create a managed identity
Yeah.
that the application, that the Azure function inherits when it starts up. So it can go and internally, there's an endpoint on the Azure function or the Azure virtual machine, just like your instance endpoint on AWS, where you can get your credentials from. So the application just calls that endpoint, says, "Hey, I want some credentials," and with those temporary credentials, I can then go and authenticate against other services and do something.
Interesting. And so, am I right in putting this under the same camp as robot users as well,
Yes
or are
and
they?
yes and no. So I could obviously also go and just create an app registration and
Yep.
give that app registration access to Cosmos DB, and my function would get from the environment variables, for example, get the app ID and secret.
Yep.
Um, but then I have to go and rotate the secret every time. Yeah, I have to go and manage that app registration. The
Ah.
managed identity is managed, as the
Okay.
name says.
So maybe if I
I
take a
don't
step,
even know. Yeah, sorry, I
sorry,
don't
I was gonna
even know
say if
what
I
the
take a step back,
yeah.
when in what scenario am I using managed identity, and what scenario am I using app registration? So that's maybe a better way to ask this question then. What? So if I'm listening to this for the first time and I'm like, oh shit, I've been hard coding my connection strings, or I've been giving access to, I don't know, name application X Facebook,
Mhm.
I guess by creating an Azure AAD user. But what's what are the use cases for using a managed identity versus app registration?
Yeah. So managed identities are not supported by every resource. Yeah. The the most important resources that would need a managed identity do support it. So Azure Virtual Machines support managed identities. Azure Functions support managed identities. I think AKS, so Azure Kubernetes Services, they support managed identities now. Logic Apps support managed identities. So from the platform point of view, the most important services that would need it do support it. Now the question, however, is does the application know how to get credentials from the managed identity endpoint. In our case, for example, because we are writing the application, we know how cloud works, we understand cloud, we know that we don't go and hard code credentials, we don't use an app registration, we just create the managed identity and our code knows how to deal with that. If you've got a legacy COTS application running on an Azure virtual machine, and your vendor says, by the way, we only support up to Windows Server 2008, which, by the way, is end of life, dead, don't use it anymore. But then there's a very high chance that that application, if it needs to go and authenticate to a storage account or a Azure SQL database, for example, then there's a very high chance that they don't know how to use a managed identity endpoint, and they might ask you to either put in the app ID and app secret, or even a username and password to, let's say, take a disk snapshot and put it into a storage account.
Right. That's a good segue into the question around the fact that what's the difference in deployment between, say, a startup, or how do you see that scale difference between, say, a startup versus a more mature organization in Azure?
I think that so from a startup point of view, and Argos is probably a really good example for that. We absolutely care about providing business value, right? As a startup, I am never going to make money by managing a virtual machine and patching a Linux server or a Windows server, or trying to figure out how to run this bash script on a Ubuntu server, right? Never. Unless I have a startup that does that, that's not my business. My business is to create business value and provide business value, which is why startups will usually tend to go to more PaaS and managed offering, right? So Argos, for example, we are fully serverless. We have a static HTML app on storage accounts, a static website connecting to Azure Functions. So your functions as a service with a NoSQL backend. And there's no need for us to worry about patching any infrastructure. We need to worry about patching our code, obviously, and dependencies. But we don't have to worry about running apt-get every second time we do something. The other end, and I think the much more common deployment method is, and that's true for Azure, but almost certainly also true for most other cloud providers, is there's a virtual machine that gets deployed, that on a good day is deployed into a scaling group and knows how to scale up and down and in and out and in. And there's a database backend. So usually we do see a lot of virtual machines still in the cloud.
Interesting. And to your point, I think this is kind of like towards the tail end as well, but I wanted to kind of clarify, if I am at either one of those stages, right? I'm at a startup level or kind of like to your point about mature enough that I'm using serverless. Is there, I guess, recommendations, the kind of identity should I have in a small team versus a large team? Or like, I know it's a very broad topic and it could be very specific to the use case, but is there almost like a general pattern for if you are a small firm, I don't know, just use AAD users, SSO, whatever. Like if you're a bigger user, then you have a complex layer of, you have managed identities, app registrations, you've got all these complex things to deal with. How does this scale really well? And if this is a startup listening to this, where can they start right now, or by setting the right foundation so that it allows, it's almost like if I were to call it out as anyone listening to that, build the right foundations from an identity perspective, how should they be thinking about this now so that tomorrow, when they become the next Facebook and sell for $700 million, at least this is what they would still be ready.
Yeah. So the good thing is, if you get, you're most likely not going to get yourself into a dead end. No, almost no matter what you do, there's always an out. And as a startup, I would say you have your tenant. You don't have to federate because you're most likely not going to have anything to federate from. Yeah. So there's no federate your Active Directory into AAD, because startups usually don't have any on-prem Active Directories. So start with your tenant, secure the tenant. People do like to see that you know what MFA is. People do like to see that you understand basic security principles like that. You don't log in with your highest privilege user. You log in with a base role and have the way to escalate into or elevate your permissions into a higher role. And then you go and scale on the inside of your subscription initially. So you create a subscription, and then as a startup, you have a non-prod resource group, a dev resource group. And I think in the 101 podcast the other week, you talked about resource groups a bit. So you scale inside of that one subscription. That one subscription is highly scalable already. And then you start creating more subscriptions the larger you get. You might have a subscription for, at some point, then non-prod and prod and dev. The nice thing is you can move resources across subscriptions quite easily.
Oh, really? I don't know that. So it's not...
Yeah.
It's really interesting because I think, well, coming from an AWS, and I don't know if it's Google and is the same as well, but you can't really move that easily. So you kind of have to do the whole, I don't know, architecture debacle at that point. How do I migrate my data? But so I can have an object in one subscription A and I can move that to subscription B.
Yeah, without downtime. So
wow. Sorry, I would let you continue. I just thought I was like something worth calling out.
It's actually quite nice. I think it's fair to say that ideally, the way to move something is to just point your pipeline at the other subscription and deploy from infrastructure as code and automation. But I think when we're outside of this ideal world bubble, then there is still a lot of ClickOps happening and people deploying things manually.
La.
So
cannot hear you, David. I'm too far away.
So it's absolutely possible to then move something to a different subscription. The larger you get, at some point an enterprise might even go and say, actually, we do also need a non-prod tenant. Yeah, so not just because there might be things that they want to test inside of that non-prod tenant or against the tenant. It might also be that they take the whole separation of consents and the blast radius very, very seriously, and say everything non-prod needs to be in the non-prod tenant, and only non-prod subscriptions live underneath the non-prod tenant. And there's no connection from that tenant to on-prem. It's completely separate and isolated.
Right. So, but then, okay, to your point, to summarize, startup land, one subscription, you still have enough resources to work with. Absolutely. As you grow, add more subscriptions, have some segregation. And then you go into the complex land of app registration when you talk about third-party app registration. And when you're talking about designing for, I guess, for the future, that's when you kind of talk about managed identities where you're using different kinds of functions. Is that how you would say it?
Yeah, I think startups will probably, and if you already talk about serverless as a startup, they will probably already start using managed identities and app registrations, because it's the easiest way to achieve your goal. If you're writing the
Cost effective as
application,
well, I guess.
yeah. And it's the simplest way to just get to where you need to go.
Interesting. We are kind of towards the tail end of our show as well. I think I believe the 45 minutes went by so quickly as well. I've got 3 fun questions for you. And because you're a return guest, I wonder some of your answers have changed since the last time we spoke. Because
Right.
that was like pre-COVID and now post-COVID. Well, not post-COVID yet, in COVID. So maybe we can have a post-COVID episode as well to come the whole circle. But just want to ask, what do you spend most time on when you're not working on cloud or technology?
Me personally,
Oh, yes.
it's not a what are your hobbies question.
More like, I was going to say you'll probably include your flying or one of
Yeah.
those.
So I've been a private pilot for 20 years now. And I'm actually going flying right after the podcast.
Like, just so that you got the high from the podcast and now you're just doing it again, and while literally going high, sky high.
So I think if I don't talk about technology and cloud, you will catch me talking about planes, and sometimes at the same time.
Fair point. And yeah, I can vouch for if you guys follow David O'Brien on his social, you probably see the pictures of amazing shots of Melbourne as well. What is something that you're proud of which is not on your social media?
Not on. I think I share way too much on social media. Without being too I don't know, too
personal, too open.
Not but
Don't cry, man.
I'm very proud of what I've built over the last 10 or 12 years in my career now. I'm very proud about being able to move continents 6.5 years ago. Because clearly I'm not Australian.
What, really?
Yeah.
Why would I think that?
It's difficult to pick up, but that's not an Australian accent. So I'm very proud of the fact that my wife Sandra and I, we've been able to achieve this big move.
Now, well, I think moving countries is not easy, no matter what the age. So good on you guys as well. The final question: what's your favorite restaurant or cuisine that you can share with?
Pre-COVID?
Well, let's just say in COVID, because I know your pre-COVID answer, and probably the guest or the audience listening in as well knows it. So in COVID, what's been your favorite go-to dish or restaurant, I guess, considering takeaways are still open in Melbourne?
Yeah. So we live in Geelong, right? So we're not
G-Town.
We're not technically in the very strict lockdown. So we're allowed to go further than 5 kilometers. We've been to a really, really nice truffle farm up near Ballarat, where they had a truffle dog, just like what we have, a Lagotto, hunt truffle. So we actually did a truffle hunt. So they let the dog loose on that farm, and the dog dug up the truffle. And we then had, and we then had truffle pizza. So the truffle that we just hunted in the morning, they shaved them onto the pizza. That was really so. I think to answer the question, it's the cuisine with the nicest experience around it. I just like to eat, and if there's a really nice experience, nice people around, then I think that's the cuisine I really like.
Oh, nice. And we have a few people who are ex-Geelong here as well. It seems like Vinith used to live in Geelong as well. But thanks so much for your time. And where can people find you if they have any follow-up questions on this Azure identity questions?
Yeah, so I'm obviously on LinkedIn. So you can find me there, David O'Brien. I'm on Twitter at David_O'Brien.
Mm-hmm.
I'm on, if you have any consulting questions, you can reach out on xirus.com.au, XIRUS. And if you want to know more about cloud security posture management, that's the startup that we are about to launch very, very soon, called Argos. So you can go to argos-security.io to learn more about that.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks so much for joining us this time. And I'll add that in the show notes as well so people can reach out. But thanks so
Absolutely.
much for your time again. And can't wait to... Sorry?
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Can't wait to have you again, man. Thanks so much again. I'll talk to you soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ashish.